my name is Adam Turl. I'm with the International Socialist Organization. We publish Socialist Worker newspaper, and I've also very occasionally had a chance to write an article for the International Socialist Review. And I used to go to school here, not that that makes me any more or less credible. Since I only have 7 or 8 minutes, I'm not going to attempt to go through certainly the sort of the classical Marxist theory of imperialism in great detail, as was argued by Lenin and Bukharin, or the developments around the idea since World War I. Instead, I wanted to focus on 2 things. Some very basic stuff about ideas around the theory and assert that they still largely apply. And I think one of the most important debates, I think, on the left as it relates to the question of imperialism, do workers, to the vast majority of people here in the United States or in other economically advanced capitalist countries benefit or not from imperialism, and what does that say for the prospects about building an anti-imperialist movement? I think colloquially, excuse my mispronunciation of colloquially, whatever, imperialism is often used to describe maybe bad foreign policy or empire generally, whether it's the Roman Empire, Spanish colonization of the Americas, or the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And like I hinted before, Marxists tend to mean something more specific, that economic competition between major capitalist countries tied to finance capital, large banks, trusts, big corporation, tends to lead to political and military competition and conflict between different countries. And a competition for colonies, zones of influence, and today trade, political, and production networks, things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, the European Union, in order for the dominant capitalist powers to exploit, plunder, and use the markets of larger parts of the world. And I think that dynamic continues today. So for example, in the Middle East, the U.S. has invaded Iraq, and people rightly say for oil, but it's not just to sort of take the oil and then bring it back here so I can drive around in my SUV, not that I have an SUV, but to control the oil, partly because they're in economic competition and political competition with China that's using ever larger amounts of energy as it's industrializing right now. Am I going to get a warning when I'm...
Sure, yeah.
Okay, like maybe 2 minutes or something? Cool.
You've only taken up 2 minutes. So.
All right, great. Therefore, it's not simply about a bad foreign policy, but a necessity in terms of, for the ruling elites that rule the United States, that's driven by capitalist competition. And I think if that's the case, if war is endemic to the system itself, endemic to capitalism, it's necessary to raise the question of agency, of what force has the power and interest to oppose it, and I think get rid of imperialism once and for all. And sort of the classical Marxist position in mind is that working class people, the vast majority of people in the United States, the mass of wage workers, whether you work in an auto plant, at a Walmart, in offices, if you're a janitor, nurse, transport, I won't go through the list of all the jobs in the world. But most anyone who relies on selling their labor for a wage in both imperial and oppressed countries have the power and the interest to oppose imperialism for a number of reasons. One, because working class people are exploited. 2, because of the power workers have to shut down the system partially or wholly through partial or general strikes. And 3, workers tend to be the majority in most countries, or at least a plurality, and they tend to make up, for example, in the United States, the majority of enlisted folks in the armed forces. And I think one of the major questions on the left, and I brought it up before, certainly during the economic boom that followed World War II and during the rise of the New Left of the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, was the question of whether or not that the U.S. workers, the majority of people in the United States, benefited from U.S. imperialism, the United States' plunder of the world. I think most of the New Left eventually took the position in one form or another that at least large layers of the American working class did benefit materially from U.S. imperialism. I don't believe that argument was ever correct, but I believe it holds even less water today than it did then. I think the economic costs of imperialism are accrued almost entirely by those the U.S. exploits and oppresses abroad, and by working class people here at home. Certainly, the oil contracts and privatization that has occurred in Iraq is a wholesale theft of the wealth of Iraq, and up to the $1 trillion that the United States is expected to expend on the war is largely going to be paid for by Iraqis and by U.S. workers. For example,
you have another 3 minutes.
Sorry?
3.
Okay, cool. Thanks. For example, here in Chicago with the county healthcare cuts, where they're talking about 17% across the board cuts at the only healthcare provider for 1.1 million people in the Chicago area who do not have health insurance. This is a huge expenditure being paid by the poorest people here in Chicago. And the benefits are accrued, I think, almost entirely by the very wealthy here and by tiny groups of collaborators abroad. The Halliburtons, the Kellogg Brown and Roots, the Bechtels, the Ahmad Chalabais before he fell out with the United States. And similar things can be said about the human cost as well, in terms of, according to the study by the Lancet Medical Journal and Johns Hopkins, over 600,000 Iraqis have been killed, and as we know, over 3,000 American soldiers have been killed and thousands more wounded in the war in Iraq. Now, working class people in the United States may identify ideologically with U.S. imperialism, I think, but I think this is to our own detriment. It's been, I think, one of the greatest weaknesses of the U.S. labor movement that large parts of the leadership of the labor movement since World War II have identified with the national economic interests of major U.S. corporations and the drive for U.S. corporations to maintain their competitiveness with other firms around the world. That means that corporations have demanded more and more concessions from U.S. workers, especially since the 1970s, in order to compete. And a lot of times unions have gone along with that, and it's meant a massive decline in terms of the standard of living, the conditions of work, and the wages of most workers in the United States. And then further, by using trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, U.S. corporations have put workers in the United States into greater competition with lower wage workers in Mexico, driving down wages here, and also creating higher unemployment in Mexico, for example, by exposing Mexican agriculture and industry to a system set up to benefit U.S. firms. So paradoxically, even though jobs, what used to be the high-paying union industrial jobs in the United States may move a plant to Mexico, but Mexico has seen an actual decline in employment because of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And I think this has happened to the detriment of the majority of people in the United States, but there's been big dividends for U.S. corporations. In the 1990s, the United States' share of gross national product, the gross wealth produced in the world, which had been in decline in the 1970s and 1980s, started to rebound. But at the same time, wages, security, benefits, union rights for workers throughout most of the 90s continued to decline. And then were decimated even further in this decade. Just one statistic, in Illinois, between 2001 and 2004, median family income declined by about $6,000, and Illinois lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs. So I think it's safe, I would like to argue that workers here do not benefit from, for example, the theft of Iraqi oil or the undercutting of Mexican industry and the exploitation of Mexican workers or workers around the world, but quite the opposite. And I think that leads me to the question I want to ask as I wrap up my introductory remarks. I think, what are the prospects for a movement, an anti-imperialist movement here in the United States and among working class people here in the United States? It's time. This is the last bit. Okay. More than, I think, to start off with, and I can't get into all of it, but to start off with, more than 60% of the U.S. population has demonstrated repeatedly in polls in the elections, despite what the Democrats are actually offering, repeatedly their opposition to the war in Iraq. I believe that the material is there for anti-imperialist ideas to take root in the United States. I think imperialism breeds anti-imperialism. The crisis in Iraq, the economic crisis facing millions of workers here at home, has bred opposition to the war just as it has bred opposition to the occupation within Iraq. But we face a situation, and I believe it's one that some of the comrades here have been discussing on campus in the Platypus group, about how to rebuild a left that can actually present anti-imperialist ideas. When somebody turns against the war, an American worker turns against the war, is there somebody there to put forward an anti-imperialist analysis? Are the newspapers, the radical publications, the organizations, the anti-war groups there to articulate an opposition to the war and to imperialism that makes sense? And I think we're in a position of largely rebuilding that. Or do people hear the sort of common sense answers that are being put forward sort of by the Nancy Pelosi's and the Barack Obamas? They'll say that this war in Iraq, for example, is just a horrible mistake, a policy mistake, rather than part of imperial project in the Middle East that is, of course, connected, in my opinion, to the war in Afghanistan and to the U.S. support for the occupation of Palestine and the imperial needs of the United States overall. So I want to end with saying that the left needs to be rebuilt, and in that process of building as large as possible anti-war movement, like the protests we saw last weekend in Washington, D.C., the protests that will be coming up in March against the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and that has to be organized. And I think right now rulers are facing something of a crisis around the debacle in Iraq, and now is the time to seize a moment and the next moment to organize that. Thank you.